at Calvary Chapel Mountain Center. Here I am again on your screen, joining you through the power of technology. But the church is one nevertheless, and I pray you are having a fantastic gathering together, worshiping and encouraging each other. So this week, I'd like to look at Exodus chapter 2 with the themes that we were armed with from Exodus 1. So we looked at the introduction, those 7 verses. They were screaming for us to be reading Exodus in light of the book of Genesis. And so I'd like to help us do that and uncover some of these threads that underlie the story. I remind you that some of the main themes that the first chapter brought together was the exile of the nations at Babel, and God's creating a nation for himself through Abram to bless those peoples. And ultimately, all that tied into Israel, Abram's descendants, and Israel ties back to creation because the Creator God himself is working through them to accomplish his purposes, to rescue his creation, to bring humanity back onto the plan, the blessed and awesome plan that he had intended in the first place. So, last week we ended on this verse in Exodus 1, verse 22, which reads, "Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, 'Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive.'" With this note, our story continues into chapter 2. In verse 1, we read that a Levite man takes a Levite woman to be his wife. Now, I'd just like to remind you that a lot of these details are very intentional, and they're not accidental in Old Testament narrative. It's very carefully crafted, and there's something specific going on with these details. So we would know that eventually the Levites serve as priests, and so we're being prepared here to think of this baby in chapter 2 coming from this Levite man and Levite woman. We're prepared to think of him in priestly terms. Who knows, maybe he'll have something to do with mediating God's law and presence or something like that. In verse 2, we get the detail that when this child was born, the mother saw that he was beautiful. And we know this is actually Moses, the author of this book, and so this often becomes the brunt of many pulpit comments like, "Oh, clever Moses, look at him flatter himself as he writes the book," and a lot of jokes like that. But all of that completely misses the point. A better translation of the Hebrew is, "And she saw him, that he was good, so she hid him 3 months." It just uses the simple word for good. And what our translations have done is interpret that word good to be referring to the boy's looks, his appearance. And so they'll make it idiomatic. He's beautiful, he's good in appearance. But let's just think about that for a moment. Is the point that if he didn't look good, if he wasn't beautiful, the mother would have been more willing to drown him? Or really, I mean, what mother wouldn't look at their child and think they're the most beautiful thing ever, right? I don't think that's what's going on. Instead, this phrase, that she saw him, that he was good, is a clear echo back to Genesis 1, where 7 times God is the one seeing and declaring that something is good. It's the same phrase here. So in the immediate context, what is happening is that this mother is doing what God does. She's making a correct assessment about the goodness of something. Pharaoh, on the one hand, has said that this child is not good. He's dangerous, he represents a threat to national security, and he needs to be destroyed. But she disagrees. She sees that the child is a precious life. And in doing so, she lines up with God's assessment. So, and in the larger context, what this connection does is it gives the Exodus story, once again, creational undertones. This is a creation story. It implies that through this child, that is good, something new is coming into being. So, if we already know, if we've read this story, that this is not just the birth of one baby, but the birth of a nation through that baby who would become their leader. So she obeys Pharaoh's command to put the baby in the Nile, but she's very slick, and what she does is put him in a basket. Verse 3 tells us that she sealed it with tar and pitch, and we should notice here that in verse 3, the word translated basket is in fact the same word used for Noah's boat in Genesis 6 through 9. And once again, those are the only 2 places in the whole Old Testament where the words occur. So very clear connection between the baby's basket here and Noah's boat in Genesis 6 through 9. Moreover, the tar and pitch that she covers it with echoes Noah also waterproofing it with materials. So we are being invited to compare this story to the flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 9. So allow me to summarize a few things from that story to help us catch the point here. First of all, the flood story is deeply connected to the creation story itself, which should be no surprise. If Exodus is drawing on Genesis, it probably has something to do with creation. The flood story depicts God reversing creation, or decreating his world in judgment, only to begin again. Well, this is exactly how the Apostle Peter views it in his second epistle in chapter 3. He talks about how the flood ended one world and brought a new world, and how that foreshadows Christ's coming, his final judgment, bringing a new creation. So Peter helps us see it that way, but it was already clear in the original story that this was a decreation, a recreation. And it was clear through the symbol of water. Water had very clear and profound symbolic value in the Genesis story, and for that matter, the rest of the Old Testament. So I'd like to explore a little bit this symbol, but I'll go into way more detail when we get to chapter 14 where they cross the sea. Think back once again to creation, chapter 1 of Genesis. The account begins with a mention of the deep, dark, watery abyss. Genesis 1 verse 2. Now the land was disordered and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. But the wind spirit of God was fluttering over the surface of the waters. In the Old Testament, and for all Israel's neighbors, for that matter, this was a standard symbol for the pre-creation state. So this is how they imagined what was nothing before creation happened. It was this deep, dark ocean, chaotic, not habitable, in fact, filled with scary monsters. We'll explore that more later, but this is how they describe nothingness. There's no land, there's no order, no stability. It's a chaotic, forbidding ocean. Creation was an act of bringing order and rhyme and function to an otherwise uninhabitable and undifferentiated mass of water. And so water was thought of as a destructive force, a force that opposes creation, where we need order and air and land to live. Water threatened life on dry land if there was too much of it. Humans can't live on land. And so, water, obviously we can't live on land. And so this is exactly the way the flood story is portrayed, as a sort of decreation through water. God lets the waters crash back into his creation and undo what he had done in separating the waters. So just as God's wind, I remind you that the word for wind and spirit is the same in Hebrew. One word captures both concepts. For them it's linked, wind and spirit. So just as God's spirit wind was over the water at creation, in the flood, a wind from God subsided the waters. In both cases, it's God's spirit wind that brings peace to the threatening waters. This brings us to another connection between the flood story and the Genesis account. In the creation story, when God creates the sky, he does so by separating that undifferentiated mass of water, creating space in between it. Translations may say firmament or dome, but the point is he separates the water, and in doing so, there's water above and there's water below. And in the flood account, when God sends the flood, when God stops the flood, he does that by releasing or restraining the water above and the water below. Another connection, just as the dry land emerges from the water in day 3 of creation, so the mountaintops are mentioned emerging from the water at the end of the flood. There's actually many of these little verbal and conceptual links between the stories, but most importantly, Noah and his family are seen as the new humanity emerging from creation and being the new Adam. That's why God blesses them the same. He says to Noah and his family, he blesses them. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the land." And he gives them the same commission to rule over the animals and such. So Noah is like a new Adam. And I remind you how we talked about how Abram's like a new Noah. So there's this theme of God starting over with individuals who are key leaders, key representatives, and ultimately that ends in Christ as the head of humanity. So as Exodus echoes the ark and the flood story and compares it to the basket and the Nile with this baby Moses, once again the narrative is given cosmic significance, big, universal creation significance. This is not just the story of one baby boy and one people's, but it is the story of God and his creator, his creation purposes through this people. So this new Noah, so to speak, floating safely on the watery chaos is going to be a new start for the people of God. God's creational purposes are being tied to this baby boy as much as they were with Israel back in chapter 1. Also, because of the link to the destructive chaos waters, before creation, the flood, and the Nile River, because of that connection, this baby is depicted as being plunged into death, plunged into chaos. It's like he's already dead. He's been thrown into the Nile. That's what Pharaoh wanted to happen. He wanted him to die. But what happens instead is that the baby is taken out of this basket, and he cries before his mother, and he's given a name. Before he was silent, he was plunged into death, but he emerges to a new mother with a new name, and he cries as though he has just entered the world. So it's as though this baby has gone into death and been reborn again. And all of that through this symbol of water, as this chaotic symbol of death and chaos. It's very subtle, but it's a death and resurrection theme, if believe it or not. And it makes sense that we would see that, because Jesus, remember, when he rose from the dead in Luke 24, he said, wasn't it written in all the scriptures of the Old Testament that the anointed one must die and be raised to new life? And so when Jesus spoke about the anointed figure dying and rising, in the Old Testament, he's talking about all the anointed figures. This would be Adam, Noah, Abram, Moses, Israel, ultimately. It just means God's chosen partner, covenant partner. So we should not be surprised when reading Old Testament narrative to see this theme of God's anointed partner dying and rising again. And here we see it with baby Moses. Next, the boy's sister watches from a distance, waiting to see what would become of her brother. And behold, the story says, it's inviting us to behold, look, one of Pharaoh's daughters noticed the basket hidden away in the reeds. And she opened it, and she saw him, and she had compassion on him because he was crying. So she drew him out of the water and reeds, and his name became Moses, which sounds like the Hebrew word for drawing out. And then we get a little story as Moses as an adult, once again confronting injustice and the oppression of the Israelites, and then again stepping in to save some helpless women at a well. But after both these stories of Moses as an adult, we read this conclusion in verses 23 and 25. And it happened in those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel groaned from the work, and they cried for help, and their cry went up to God from their work. And God heard their pains, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice. This obviously sets us up for the story to continue, but it also does something else. Previously, we read about Pharaoh's daughter seeing the child crying, having compassion on him, and saving him, bringing him into her family. And that's what God does here. God hears and sees the cry of his people, and he sets his mind to save them. That's what remembering his covenant means. So there's a parallel between what Pharaoh's daughter felt for baby Moses and what God feels for suffering Israel. What Pharaoh's daughter did for Moses, God will do for the Israelites. This little parallel prepares us to think that way. You read this and you think, oh, we just read about Moses being compassioned, receiving compassion and being saved at his cry and being brought into a family. And then we hear God say, remember his covenant, and hear their cry and have compassion. So what will become of the Israelites? Will they become part of God's family? Will God rescue them? There are actually a lot of links between it. Israel's story and Moses' story in the book of Exodus. You read the first half about Moses, you read the second half about Israel, and you find a lot of parallels. And we've come across the biggest one today. Let me explain. Red Sea, in our translations, is actually sea of reeds in Hebrew. And why we translate it that way is a long and complicated piece of tradition, but it means sea of reeds in Hebrew. And in our text today, Moses is drawn from the water and from the reeds. Same word. Israel is going to pass through the sea of reeds. So Moses' sister is also mentioned here, standing at a distance as Moses crosses, so to speak, the sea of reeds. And at the end, when Israel's crossing, or about to cross, Moses' sister is still there. And Moses says something very similar. Stand and see the salvation of the Lord. whereas the sister earlier stood and saw what would happen to the Savior of God's people. So there's going to be more of these connections between Moses' story and Israel's story. And we'll look at them as we go through the book. But what they do is they create a pattern of the people's experience following the experience of their leader. It creates a very firm pattern which continues throughout the Old Testament and ultimately gets picked up in the New Testament to speak about the church's experience following Jesus' experience. For example, we die in baptism. We enter into the waters, we die, and are raised with Christ. We share in the sufferings of Christ so that we can share in His glory. And so our experience, our faith, our spirituality really is a reenactment of Jesus' life. And that's how the New Testament asks us to think about our present experience in that Christological way. But that's all for observations in Exodus 2 about the story of Genesis